welcome back to my channel. It's your girl Alana here. Welcome back to 3 Degrees of Love Divination. So I'm bringing to you today a very humbling video. And one that I consider, to me at least, transforming. The events that led up to inspiring this video, as unfortunate as it was, it ended up being a very pivotal, transforming event for me, that I feel sort of led to another level of my spiritual awakening and ascension, if you will. It brings me right back to the tarot activity book published under Andy Matzner by Drea Bloom, and just comes to confirm why I love Drea and her work, why I love this book in particular so much. And with that, I figured with the activity that I want to address in this book, I figured why not better suited, because I'm still working with the biblical tarots, and seeing that there are two of them. We have the second edition, along with the shadow work edition that was lovingly gifted to me by the creator, Krasimir. And so for the purpose of review and for videos like this, so I am so honored and grateful to have all of these. And of course, the tarot activity book was gifted to me as well by Drea. So just how in alignment, all of this is, and how the events of our lives, when we really pay attention, can really teach us something about ourselves and each other. And it is now the other sort of piece of synchronicity, I guess, if you will, is in all of this is we're in, even as I'm filming this, in and around the Gemini new moon, and I am a Gemini moon sign. And for those of you that don't know astrology, and of course those of you who do know astrology will, your moon sign is what governs your emotions, how you process your emotions, and the characteristics behind, the signs, and how that, all determines that. But I remember hearing a while back that, that when the whole thing to understand about astrology, and especially, the top main three, look at that number again, 3, the power of 3. Now I have to pin that point because that can trigger another, rabbit hole, which I do want to get to. but I want to finish what I'm saying. And I know I have it, the way my brain moves so fast, sometimes I can jump right into another without even finishing the first point. So, well, okay, so the power of 3, but that, prior to that, I was saying I was talking about our astrological signs. There we go. And how, that can really play an effect. And I remember hearing once that, and it made so much sense. And this was a TikTok video, I think, an astrologer or something that made a TikTok video. And they were basically talking about, understanding the signs. And especially with the top 3, your sun sign. So I am a Virgo sun. And as I said, I'm a Gemini moon, but I'm a Libra rising. And along the way, I heard that the sign you're born into often ends up being, when you reach a certain level of fulfillment, spiritually speaking, astrologically, whatever, it's your moon and your rising, or your moon sign that is supposed to, well, actually, your moon sign and your rising sign that are supposed to equally help you in reaching the full potential of your sun sign. With your bye-bye light. With your, hopefully you guys can still see clearly enough. But with your moon sign, of course, being your emotions, right? Your and your rising sign being how people see you, how the perception that other people have about you, and the characteristics that follow suit. And so ultimately, in that, as we progress in life, it's your moon and your rising that help you to reach your full sun potential, if that makes sense. Okay. So now, back to the 3, and the power of 3. So, in my last video, if you haven't seen that one, and that was the reading I did with the Thoughtful Journey Oracle deck. And at one point, I spoke about the Holy Trinity. My life path number being 3, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And if you want to know what the yada, yada is, go check out my previous videos. The thing with the Holy Trinity, right, and the understanding of light and shadow, and the awareness of having the light and shadow, the yin, the yang, and really understanding all of spirituality, and not just picking and choosing. And in the light and shadow of things, we're looking at, the lighter side of spirituality, and practices versus the darker side, and how all of that makes the whole. However, when you're not grounded and you adhere to one side versus the other, that in and of itself determines the path in life. Are you moving on a path that is of equal give and take? Are you over giving, or are you overtaking and feeding the ego? That is the understanding of the dark side of things. But in a balanced and harmonious union, and this is where I spoke about that fine line that exists between the two, and how the whole of our existence lies within that balance. And so it's not a matter of, this or that. It's this and that. And how the two meet to make the greater whole. But when we fall too far on one side versus the other, we fall into this this karmic cycle of good versus evil. The understanding of the law of karma. So when we betray others, the law of karma comes back as the overarching teacher. Same goes for when you become an overgiver. It's about now learning and being taught that what you overgive and betray of self will continue to happen as long as you let it. Right? And those karmic patterns can be etched into our family's history as well. Right? And now we're at the epitome of our entire existence is at war. Now, sort of bringing this back to a more sort of personal level, and how all of this sort of came to be is, and as if you're just joining me, my name is Alana. I am, on a spiritual journey for healing. I am a social worker. I burnt out in my field, and I found my way down the rabbit hole to tarot and how transformative, tarot has been on my path to healing. And because of the events in my life, I've become a strong advocate for mental health. And did I mention I'm a Hakoya empath? If I didn't, there you go. And so, and that's something that is more of a newer discovery on my journey forward and spiritual awakening, if you will. Not something I necessarily knew before. Same thing with really learning and understanding the fact that I'm neurodivergent. And all of those steps taken on that sort of self-discovery, if you will, excuse me. And so, and of course with, me personally, engaging in regular therapy sessions, I saw the benefit of combining tarot with all of that. And that is also, what eventually led me, to find the tarot activity book, and for it to be such a staple in my work and the practice that, I've developed and for myself, and ultimately want to, further develop into something I can share with others, professionally speaking. But for now, as I continue on my path forward, this is where I'm at. So if you like my content, please, please like, share, and subscribe. And hit the notification bell so you'll always be updated when I post my next video. But anyway, back to this, and my whole point and understanding my emotions and, and my triggers and things like that, over this, just at the beginning of the weekend, or the end of the week, if you last week, but it went right through to the weekend. I was emotionally tested and triggered, by someone I love and means a lot to me. But and just sort of goes back to the understanding of the butterfly effect. And the other synchronicity that goes along with that, other than the number 3, is the fact that I have always suffered from eczema. And later on, learning that I also suffer from seasonal allergies, when I never really suffered from seasonal allergies growing up, right into, my 30s, for the most part. But I did have eczema, which in and of itself is a an allergy condition. But anyway, but it was never for me. It was at least I never noticed it to be seasonal. It was just that, like, always, right? And anyway, and so for the most part, my eczema, I would say I had a pretty good handle on it. However, now with the seasonal allergies, I find that, it flares up more these days. But in the last couple of or well, yeah, maybe in the last couple of years, and during consistent season like now, and sometimes and well, actually, no, I find that it happens now during seasonal changes. So it doesn't matter what season, whatever seasonal changes happen, it seems to happen. Now, the last few times that it's occurred, I have ended up with a huge butterfly-shaped rash that goes up my neck, on my shoulders, and throughout my chest. It literally looks like, when I look in the mirror, looks like in the shape of a butterfly. And as I said, I've been going through this spiritual transformation. So does that have anything to do with it? I wonder. But also the significance of the butterfly in the idea of transformation. And as I said, I'm on this spiritual ascension journey, healing journey that I've been on. And how this weekend, although very painful, emotionally speaking, and had such a negative, unfortunate impact, that really speaks to the understanding of the butterfly effect, and understanding how our triggers, our trauma, which leads us to have triggers, and those triggers get activated, how that can negatively, well, not always, some positive, because sometimes that negative, whatever trigger can, turn into, a positive thing, meaning, it reveals important information, it also, can be a learning lesson, if you will, as well. And so for me, this lesson was in addressing the importance of boundaries. And how unhealed trauma and the thing is, it's not even necessarily just, the fact that it's trauma, because again, we're going back to the whole concept of light and shadow, but just even the negative impacts of social conditioning, of dogmatic religious conditioning, right? Things like that, and how they can negatively impact our choices and our interactions, and how that can negatively impact our relationships that we have. Sometimes bringing them to an unfortunate ending. All because of something that triggered us and put us into a negative cycle that we now unknowingly ended up triggering someone else. And then having to deal with the, with the aftermath of all of that. Having to take responsibility for, for our actions and what caused them, and I'm a very analytical person. I'm also very self-critical, and maybe sometimes to a fault. But this also speaks to, my human nature, and even though, yes, I'm knowledgeable in these things, I myself still can fall into these very human behaviors, even while logically knowing better, because of my emotions and my feelings and triggers that have arisen from the trauma that I've endured. And how our ancestral conditionings and woundings can also impact those. And why shadow work is so important, why it is so important for us to take the time to do the introspection and the healing work to address these things. And why, again, going back to boundaries, why boundaries are important, but also making sure that they're healthy boundaries and that they're flexible, not easily broken, but also not rigid like a steel door that we block everything out. And in life, especially for those who've endured trauma, we can easily fall on one side more than the other. And why work like this is so important. So, while this video is inspired by, true for me events, that were hurtful and in turn had a negative impact on my actions with others. That ended up causing triggers and traumas that weren't meant to be. So I hope that with the activity from the tarot activity book today that I want to look at using the biblical tarots, that we can all learn something from my experience. Because after all, this is ultimately my goal for this channel. To live, listen, and learn, and share with all of you those practices as I journey forward and as we all do. So anyway, so let's get into it. So boundaries. Objective: to learn what boundaries are and why they are important to your well-being. In general, a boundary refers to a dividing line that marks the limits of an area. But there are other dimensions to this idea, as boundaries also mark where one person ends and another begins. In a physical sense, a healthy boundary is the space around yourself that provides a feeling of security and safety. Psychologically, personal boundaries are the standards, guidelines, and limits you have which protect you from being manipulated or exploited by others. They provide a sense of the kinds of behaviors you will or will not tolerate from other people. And the boundaries you have determined how you'll respond to how others treat you. Strong boundaries allow you to deliberately choose who you will and will not allow into your personal space. These standards are important because they give you a clear sense of who you are, reinforcing the fact that you are an individual separate from everyone else. Through our actions and behaviors, we communicate to others what our boundaries are and whether they are strong or weak. Ideally, people will respect and adhere to our boundaries as long as we are able to clearly communicate what they are. You might be wondering how our boundaries come to be created. They are typically established early in our lives. Boundaries develop from a mixture of personal experience and social conditioning, which then lead to the formation of beliefs about ourselves and the place we occupy in the world. And may I say, religious conditioning also plays a big important fact in this, which technically is part of the social conditioning. But anyway, sometimes as children, we are brought up by caregivers who do not respect our boundaries. Continual violations of personal integrity, such as abuse or neglect, or emotional manipulation, and psychological manipulation, but anyways, lead to soft or weak boundaries. This leads to a unstable, diminished sense of identity, as we learn to believe that our needs are not important enough to be met. We have difficulty expressing our feelings because we are living in an environment in which they are not respected. Weak boundaries make it difficult to stand up for ourselves, and as adults, we often become people pleasers or develop codependency on others. So, that's a I want to point out a very, very big thing, and often also leads to, when I have spoken about in previous videos, and about saboteurs, and how Shazir Charmaine is the creator of that. And of course, I will have all that linked below, where, if you can do the questionnaire and see the areas, your saboteurs, that, lead to negative impact on self and how we operate with others. But anyway, also, just, the understanding of those that are born into and raised into narcissistic type families. Those that are, who are just natural narcissists, versus those that are trauma-induced narcissists, which can also, occur depending on the severity of the trauma that one has, had to endure. And, this sort of brings us back into the next part here. On the other hand, sometimes it is necessary to build high walls around ourselves for protection. If we felt as children that we had to protect ourselves from abuse at all costs, then we might have developed a defense system that was very tight and secure. A person with rigid boundaries is closed off from other people, both physically and emotionally. This type of psychic defense allows us to avoid becoming involved with others because we are afraid of getting hurt, but then can also lead to isolation, both from oneself and others. And even with that being said, those who have undergone extreme cases of abuse, my love, my heart, and goes out to those people, because it's like they never had a fighting chance. And those that come out on the other side to be well balanced, humble people, my hat's off to you. How you did it, the incredible amount of strength and resilience that it took to get you there. Is unbelievable. And why I also, see healing work and the healing journey being something that is ongoing, because at some point when we've reached a certain stage, sometimes those triggers don't go away. So so we end up having to have regular maintenance. And for some, that's an ongoing journey. That's a lifelong pursuit. So, and that's, why I always talk about the importance of being mindful. It isn't, I'm not going to lie to you, it's not always easy, and, depending on the severity of our trauma, and just because of, who we may naturally be, sometimes those combinations can make it very difficult for us to see past our own trauma. And I know that this past weekend, the way in which I was triggered led me to behave in a way that I couldn't see past my own. And so the interactions that, resulted because of that is something that I have to take responsibility for. Because I was the middle person in this case. It didn't start with me, but it didn't end up ending with me when it should have. Because I was overwhelmed. And had a hard time transmuting that energy. And now at this point, the only thing I can do is to work through it, take responsibility for it, do the shadow work on it, forgive myself, forgive others, and hope for forgiveness and consideration for me. Because at the end of the day, we're all human and no one is perfect. We are all works in progress. And as we are all mirrors to one another because we come from a larger whole, triggers are inevitable. But they don't have to be what breaks us. And that's why it's up to us all to do that work. And why I'm in alignment with this work, why I've come to this point. So anyway, okay, where was I? In an ideal world, we were able to develop flexible boundaries as children, which we could soften or harden as necessary depending on the situation. This is the healthiest option because it means we have a strong identity. We know who we are and believe that others should treat us with respect. We also are familiar with our limits and do not have difficulty saying no when necessary, although oftentimes we can. To think about your own boundaries, please answer the following questions in your journal. Do you ever ignore your own values or beliefs in order to please others? Do you allow others to define who you are? Do you depend on others to fulfill your needs? Do you feel guilty when you say no to another person? Do you feel badly about speaking up when you are treated poorly or disagree with someone? Boundaries are related to our needs and whether we know how to get them met. Tellingly, the word need comes from the West Saxon Old English noun need, meaning necessity, compulsion, duty. Now here's something very synchronistic with this as well. So I'm all about names and the meanings and things like that. And my last name has always been mispronounced as Need sometimes, which is actually spelt Nedd, Ned. And the running joke is, because The Simpsons, Ned Flanders, he's left-handed, he's, Christian, the annoying neighbor next door. But anyways, anyhow, back to my name and how just, yeah. So, and the other thing that I remember when I was looking up meanings of names and things like that, and when I looked at my last name and, and for where it derived from, if I ever find it, and I might put it up on the screen so you can see, but there was something about the name that also meant noble. And I forget what the other, or noble warrior or something like that, which was okay, wow. But anyways, a little synchronicity thing here. It is also related to the Czech naiti, which means to languish, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. I probably have butchered that, but anyways, a need, whether physical or emotional, is something that is necessary for a person's well-being. When a need is fulfilled, we feel healthy and satisfied. Unfulfilled needs leave us with ill health, frustration, and resentment. As humans, we all share the physical needs of oxygen, water, and food. Different emotional needs, however, will resonate either more strongly or weakly with us because each person is unique. But in varying degrees, most of us have a need to feel safe and secure, connected with others, acknowledged, a sense of control, loved and accepted, and that there is meaning in our life. As I mentioned above, our boundaries were often originally generated in response to needs that did not get addressed when we were children. Because they were not filled, these needs continue to haunt us throughout life and into adulthood. Thus, throwing us into our various trauma patterns and response patterns. And something that, okay, now I just lost that thought. So, okay. Oh, okay. Now there it came back. Piggy came back. And yes, piggies are my thoughts on my feelings. Anyways, because my feelings bring information. Anyways, the point I was trying to make is the fact that, you know, as we were looking at, you know, some of these things, some of the conditionings that occur for people when, you know, when they're not feeling safe and secure, right? Some of the mental health concerns that can come up and arise out of these things. So, for example, safe and secure, one might, you know, become someone who's a hoarder, connected with others, someone who becomes either extremely introverted or extremely extroverted, and has some sort of social issues, whether that be not being able to speak in public, fear of, or the people pleaser is another perfect example there. And even, I would say, okay, maybe not for there, but anyway, acknowledged, you know, the one that always has to be the center of attention, the one that forms compulsive spending, at least for me, I know that at least for the acknowledged a sense of control and love and accepted, all of these sort of, right, people pleasing here, love and accepted, a sense of control, you know, the narcissist, the you know, someone who becomes OCD, and what I more sort of recently learned, OCPD, which is another level of OCD, but is more of a personality disorder than a trauma response, and right? Okay. Although they're still, anyways, they're still slightly related, but anyway, yeah. So, okay. To get further in touch with your own needs, please consider the questions in your journal. What did you need as a child from your parents / caregivers that you did not receive? Create a fantasy in which you received the perfect nurturing from your parents. What would you have been given? What would you have heard your parents say to you? Can you accept having needs without feeling selfish? If not, what is it that you are telling yourself that prevents you? From whom did you learn those messages? Think about the following beliefs and whether you were able to develop them as a youngster. I have the right to my own opinions. I have the right to feel safe. I have the right to be myself. I have the right to ask for what I need. I have the right to make mistakes. And I have the right to be worthy of love. If you were to create a personal Bill of Rights today, what would it consist of? See if you can come up with a list in your journal. Okay, and so the next part of this activity, I'm using the, biblical tarots, going through the deck and finding, so here, let me, okay. So a card that is me, in this case, so that would be the first part, is to go through the tarot deck. If you have a tarot deck and can do this exercise with me, and I welcome you, if you feel comfortable enough, to share, how this activity was for you. If you did go through your tarot deck and you did pick a card that represented you, what was the card, and maybe even give a brief explanation as to why that resonates for you, or resonated with you, perhaps. So anyway, okay. Okay, so I've gone through the both of the decks, and I managed to pull out, I kind of made 3 piles ish. One being for the cards that I feel sort of display weak boundaries, the cards that I feel portray strong boundaries. And then I went on to grab cards that I felt sort of portrayed what I would consider more of a healthy, flexible version of boundaries. And so yeah. But to first sort of show you the cards that I felt sort of represented who I am, would be the Empress. And mainly because it is my life path card, because it's who so given my story and everything that I've gone through, there, I remember more recently on this path, whether it be last year or the year before, I can't remember because time flies so fast now, that in the midst of my deep healing journey, there was a moment when I had, it was after a long state of depression, and I felt the need to, I was taking a shower and broke down in the shower, and I remember crying, and the only thing at that moment was giving me comfort. I felt really weak to the point where I couldn't even, I laid down in the shower because something about the water beating on me was comforting, was soothing. But I was in a very dark place, and I remember, crying out to Creator, and, I was mad. I was hurt. I was alone. I felt trapped and very hopeless. And because I had felt really emotionally raw, stripped of my integrity, I felt at the time. And hopeless and helpless. But I knew that I was also at a point where I had to make a choice. Do I continue on this pursuit of service, something that I know I have felt called to do? Or do I just turn myself off and shut the door on my emotions where other people were concerned, because I could not take any more of what I was going through? But I also knew in that moment, and what was hard to even accept was me doing that, making that choice, because it didn't feel right for me. It didn't feel right in my soul. It felt like if I did that, if I had shut the door on my heart like that, that I would, the world won. The world and everyone won against me, because they succeeded in changing me and who I knew myself to be and was proud of. And so in the depths of that, I remember praying and asking for strength to continue to move forward, for guidance in how to better equip myself when it came to doing this work, but to also But in doing that, the promise I felt I had to make, because I felt like I was asking for something that was something that I needed. But I felt like I could not ask without making a commitment in return, if that makes sense, at least for me anyway. And so I asked God, Spirit, the universe, that if he would grant me the gift I needed to see clearly, to have better awareness and the ability to protect myself, that I would continue to keep my heart open and ultimately be of service to humanity, to the best of my abilities, in the way that I know how. That was my promise in return, to continue on my path forward as love. And it was in that moment it was after that, of course, in the weeks to come and things like that, where messages started to to come in, and I started to feel more connected to things, even though I live like a hermit and I spend most of my time indoors, on account of what I've physically have had to endure as a result of my burnout and trauma and all of that. And that's when I think, I started to see more and get more glimpses of synchronicities and things around me. Certain things started to come into alignment, when I received the Earth, Moon, and Shadow Oracle, and how the timing of all of that sort of fell into alignment with my therapy, and and all the things leading up to this very moment. And so that is why this card and the Empress card means so much, and I feel is a true sort of reflection on who I am, who I've always deep down, even in my unconsciousness, maybe knew about myself, whether I actually knew it or not, because, there was a lot of trauma that really, impacted that knowing. But, and, and the guides that are around, the angel guides. Anyway, so that's that. But and ultimately, I always aim to, be someone who is loving, open and honest and accepting. And so when and this just comes to my own sort of critical nature, as I say, we are always our own worst critics. And, I've always, I think, held myself to such high standards that it's hard, or I take it very hard and very personally when I fall short of that. And maybe that's part of, my upbringing and my childhood conditioning and things like that, because I was always taught that, God is love, and you act in service, to God by being loving and kind to others. And so I've always naturally sort of strived towards that. But then, even with that, and having my boundaries being almost non-existent, from a very early age, I was never really taught how, because they were always invaded, emotionally, especially emotionally speaking. My trauma response was turning into a people pleaser. And it was in that I paid the ultimate price, because I burnt out significantly, and it altered the course of my my career, my life. But but then again, everything happens for a reason, right? And clearly, the shakeup of my life had to happen, because I was on the wrong path, I guess. I was on the wrong trajectory. And I realized that if what occurred didn't happen, I wouldn't have been on this path of journey for learning. I wouldn't have had the time to dive into tarot, to find, all of this. And also, I don't know if I would have been, considering the type of person that I am, if my life wasn't altered on the way that it was when it happened, that I don't think I would be here today speaking to you, because I probably would have found my demise during the pandemic. But I'm here now with all of you. And in spite of everything, that is something to be ultimately grateful for. And truly, truly, I am. Even though I still struggle at times with, still sometimes with accepting the way things are and the way that things have, transformed in my life. But the days of staying in those feelings are less and less as time goes by. Do I get triggered at times back into it? Sure. But with each passing day, I'm learning and I'm growing. And I'm honored to share that with all of you. So the cards that to me represent, and depending on how long this video is, probably gonna have to be split into two, but we'll see. The cards that I feel represent weak boundaries, and of course these are my personal opinions, and you can, feel free to share your thoughts with me, whether you agree or disagree, or even what cards came up for you if you have a tarot deck that you thought fit these categories best. So in no particular order, going through these cards. So first, this is the pile that I feel is the one that represents, well, including these, that sort of represents weak boundaries. And that is starting with the Empress. And of course, here's the two different versions of the Empress. And we have, let me make this a little bit closer. Okay. Next, we have the Six of Grains. And part of why I picked this card is because of what it says on the card here. So, calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all of the others." Mark chapter 12, verse 43, NIV, New International Version, Six of Grains, widow's generosity. Next, we have 10. Samson loses his strength. And this is the 10 of feathers. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Judges chapter 16, verse 19, NIV, New International Version. Now this is a very, 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 to me, powerful card in the representation of someone whose boundaries are being invaded. and in some ways really speaks to, now of course with this being the 10 of feathers, this is the equivalent to the 10 of swords. So this really speaks to the mentality, the impact of betraying emotional boundaries, of emotional manipulation, and why things like developing emotional intelligence and being able to have empathy is important, right? That sort of speaks to, having, again, integrity, and why striving to vibrate at the highest frequency, with the highest integrity. Now, it's funny because and I might have to, like I said, I might continue this in another video, going over the other cards, because I know that this is already long, especially when I took a pause even to just reorganize the cards. So, but as I stop at this card and allow for food for thought, I want to address something that I was, as I was reading the Illuminating the Path Within, the shadow work to book for the Biblical Tarot. There was okay, so right here, there's a part here in the book that addresses and talks about emotional frequency and the vibration chart. And one of the things that, when I was, mind you, this was at first glance. I still haven't actually gone through the entire book. Excuse me. Or even in regards to the explanation for the emotional frequency chart. But and of course I will, but the first thing that came to mind when I went over it and sort of picked up on this is, in here, at least with the chart, from what I pick up on the chart, the first thing is that the frequency as it's displayed, which I love the diagram, because I feel like it's a very good way of sort of illustrating what that vibrational energy looks like, and the different layers of frequency. But here we have low frequency emotions, contraction, natural states, and then high frequency emotions and expansion. But to me, the especially what's on the side here, the key words to define each level of frequency, I feel is on one hand, and hear me out. On one hand, one-sided. And the reason why I say that is because when it comes to emotional frequencies, I feel that there is a difference to be had between input and output. But it's the whole that we need to strive for and look at, right? And so to me, in this case, I feel like these would be the emotions that I feel are what we would import. Some of the keywords I feel are double edged and right. But for the most part, I feel like these keywords more describe the sort of the input or the states of being that are attained from when we import or have, right, from what we take in, as opposed to what we end up putting out. And so that, so that's where, it comes to, when it comes to having, balanced, a balanced way of life in our, on our boundaries, and, how we operate and move throughout life when we interact with one another. It needs to be a balance of both, right? And so the highest frequency, is, yes, I would agree, the enthusiasm, the peace, the gratitude, the joy, the love, the enlightenment, but also not just what we gain from, when we're in alignment with things that, project high frequency emotions, but also when we are aligning ourselves to that same frequency with integrity for what we give out to others from ourselves, if that makes sense. So something, just to think about, food for thought. And, I want to revisit and continue on with this activity. But for now, I will leave it there. And, stay tuned for part 2, if you will, of maybe 3 parts. We'll see. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to listen. If you've made it this far, please, I ask for you to let me know that you've made it this far in the comments. And, share with me one thing about yourself that you would like me to know. And I hope that you will join me for the continuation of this. And I want to thank you so much for being here. As I always say, I am love and so are you. As I see myself as human, I know you are too. And so with all of that being said, I hope that you will take what I said with a grain of salt. It will bring you some sort of level of clarity, if you will, whether that be about me or, my purpose or even about yourself, and your purpose. And, you know, please always remember to take care of yourself and one another. And while you're at it, please don't forget about me too. Because just like you, I also have feelings too. And I hope that you will return and that you will remember to always be mindful. Remember to check your privilege and mind your magic. And as always, live, listen, and learn. I love you. Bye, everybody.